It's a great pleasure to be here tonight in the beautiful museum here in Dundalk. First of all, we have a lovely portrait which was painted for this year because we're celebrating two anniversaries this year. One is the 400th anniversary of St Oliver's birth, and the second is the 50th anniversary of his canonization. And this beautiful portrait, which is about more than a metre high, was written by, it's more an icon than a painting, was written by Fintan Tracy early in the year. And it's a beautiful painting, and it'll be displayed in Drogheda. We'll move on. Here we have our St Oliver pin badge, which was specially produced, a beautiful badge. I'm wearing one here. A beautiful badge which was produced for the anniversary year. St Oliver was born in 1625 in Loughcrew, Oldcastle, County Meath. His family were the Plunketts, and reasonably well off. They were related to, I won't go into great detail, but they were related to the Earls of Fingal at Killeen. They were related to the Plunketts of Dunsany. They were related to the Barons of Louth, Lord Louth. So they had quite a few influential connections, if you like. They weren't in the upper echelons. They didn't have such big estates. The Plunketts had about 750 acres of good land, good mead land around Loughcrew and Oldcastle. And his mother was Thomasina Dillon. She was a first cousin of Christopher Plunkett, the second Earl of Fingal, and his father was, he's sometimes styled the Baron of Loughcrew, but strictly speaking, he wasn't a baron. But they were quite well off, in the sense of relatively well off. They had, as you can see, the church, an old tower house, and they had a corn mill, which they operated, and there were said that there were about 50 cabins on the estate. So Oliver would have been mixing with those children in the cabins in the estate, and the language of the time, of course, was Irish. So Oliver would have been quite familiar with the Irish language at that time. Here we have Killeen Castle and Killeen Chapel at the castle, and operated by, owned by the Earl of Killeen. Now, Oliver was educated, of course, since the time of Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth I. Catholic education was organised. Catholic education was banned, if you like, but Catholics were able to get around that with different ways. And Oliver's family got around that by sending him to the first cousin of his mother, Father Patrick Plunkett. And he was the titular abbot, he was a Cistercian, titular abbot of St Mary's Cistercian Abbey in Dublin. But he operated from here, this chapel, which is quite a big church actually, in the middle of the countryside. He operated from there, and Oliver would have stayed with him, and Father Patrick mentioned later in one of his letters that he educated Oliver until his 16th year. The Confederation of Kilkenny was ongoing at that time, and of course the Ulster Uprising, I won't go into it in great detail, I'm sure you've covered it numerous times here. The Ulster Uprising took place in 1641. Confederation of Kilkenny then began in the following year, in 1642. And the Plunketts were heavily involved in that. Although initially they were slow, they were to be drawn into it. They were strong Anglo-Irish. They were, I suppose, strong supporters of the Crown, and very loyal. And because of the atrocities and all that was going on in the north of Ireland in particular, with the Ulster Uprising, they were loath to come on board. And it was the Earl of Killeen later on Earl of Fingal, sorry, later on, who encouraged the other branches of the family to become involved. Father Patrick Plunkett, as a Lord Abbot, titular Lord Abbot, was one of the lords sitting in the, representing the lords in the Lord's branch of the house at the Confederation of Kilkenny. And Oliver would have spent some time with him, because at his trial, some years later in 1681 in London, he mentioned that he had not been in Limerick and Duncannon and Wexford and a few places like that, at times when there were major events happening in the Confederation of Kilkenny. So he would have been with Father Patrick, it is believed. Now, another brother of Father Patrick was later styled Sir Nicholas, Nicholas Plunkett, and he was a prominent Catholic lawyer of the time. He was quite heavily involved during the 1660s in the Court of Claims, as Catholics tried to regain their property at that time after the Restoration. But earlier on, during the 1640s, he was also involved. He was a politician. He was the MP for Meath, and he became the president of the Confederation of Kilkenny later on. Now, he was a respected politician, and he was a moderating influence, as all of the Plunketts would have been in the Confederation of Kilkenny. As the Confederation, Oliver then wished to become a priest, and Father Peter Francis Scarampi was the papal envoy to the Confederation of Kilkenny. He was going back to Rome. He had been, he declined the role of papal nuncio. He wished to go back to Rome, and he brought Oliver and 3 and probably 4 other students to Rome to enter the Irish College there. And Oliver did so after a very eventful journey to Rome. Oliver entered the old Irish College, and this is the Via dei Ibernesi, the way of the Irish in Rome. And this was the Irish College here on the left, the old Irish College that's St Oliver. It's still standing. It's a Dominican college now at the moment. We have been in it, and we've taken pictures inside. And Oliver then went, in the latter part of his seminary years, he went to study theology in the Collegio Romano, and he wouldn't have known it at the time, but he was crossing over the Roman Forum. The Roman Forum had been undiscovered at that time, so several meters below his feet on the roadway going through it, it would have been the old Roman Forum, which hadn't been discovered for perhaps 200 years after that. This is the Propaganda Fide College then. In 1648, as the Confederation of Kilkenny was falling asunder, the Rinuccini censors and all of that, it became, 2 delegates were selected to go to Rome to seek the Pope's help, Pope Clement IX, and they went to Rome, and Oliver would have been delighted to see his first cousin of his mother, Sir Nicholas. Oliver wrote later that he had reared him as a child. So obviously when he had been, as he was being educated by Father Patrick, he was staying with Nicholas. And Nicholas was knighted by the Pope during that visit to Rome. Accompanying him was Bishop Nicholas French of Ferns of Wexford. While the following year, of course, the Confederation did fall asunder. In 49, Cromwell came to Ireland and with his model army and soon took over. And then we have the church went underground, of course, in most parts of the country. Oliver was ordained in Rome, in the chapel here of Propaganda Fide College in 1654. The Cromwellian conquest was still ongoing in Ireland at the time, and would have been very foolish for any young priest to come back to Ireland at that time. So he stayed on in Rome, and he stayed on in Rome despite when he entered the Irish College, he would have made a solemn promise to return to Ireland after ordination. But that wasn't possible in 1654. So he went to the Sapienza, famous university in Rome, and he studied law and obtained a doctorate in both civil and canon law there. Things were still difficult in Ireland, and in 1657 he became a professor here in the college, Propaganda Fide College, teaching theology and later controversies. So he was a top-class professor in a top-class college. In fact, he wrote about that later, that this was the premier college in the world for teaching missionaries. So he was there for 12 years in that Propaganda Fide College. Okay. In '60, of course, the English soon had enough of the Puritans and the Cromwellians, and because they were extremists, as you know, and they said, "Oh, we had got rid of Charles I, but you know, we thought he was bad, but this lad are a lot worse." So they brought monarchy was restored in 1660, and Charles II was put on the throne. Was in 1660. Then we had in Ireland, there was great difficulty in Ireland because, of course, the Court of Claims was ongoing. People were trying to retrieve and get back the land that had been taken from them. Some did, a lot didn't. Oliver Plunkett's family in Loughcrew didn't. Dunsany's got some land. The Earl of Fingall's got a fair bit of land. The Lord Louth got quite an amount of land as well. And the Earl of Carlingford, the Taffs, Theobald, they got most of their land as well. But quite a few didn't, and particularly the smaller, I suppose some of the smaller landlords didn't. Now, in 16, Ormond then was the Duke, James Butler, of course, was the Viceroy, and he was trying to, because this was an ongoing problem, the Court of Claims, trying to get back the land, etc. So there were all sorts of problems and arguments going on at that time, legal arguments as such. Now the law had been drafted, of course, in the Cromwellians' favour, and of course, and interpreted as well. So it was difficult for many of the Irish to achieve their rights in that regard. Now, Ormond then he had a great, I suppose, typical policy of divide and conquer, and he wrote himself that I devised a policy how to divide the Irish, and this is the Catholics, if you like. He introduced the remonstrance, which was an act of fealty to the king, but it repudiated papal supremacy. So it was Oliver's predecessor, Archbishop Edmund O'Reilly, who Ormond allowed come back to Ireland. He was in exile. He was allowed to come back to Ireland in order to persuade the Irish Catholics to sign this remonstrance. A number of priests did sign it, about 69 in total, but there were quite an amount more who were sympathisers and who would have. And this caused consternation in the Irish Church. And this is what I wanted to talk a little bit about tonight, of the difficulties that Oliver had and the divisions that were in the Irish Church at the time. And this impacted on his trial, and his trial coming to Dundalk, etc., and then being forwarded and dispatched to London. So, Ormond then, well, I suppose this was ongoing in the church in Ireland. As I mentioned, Oliver's predecessor was allowed to come back to Ireland, but he very quickly saw the subtext where this could not be signed by any faithful Catholic, and attention was drawn to this, so he was sent into exile again, and he died just a couple of years later in Saumur in France. In 1668 then, a friar, the church was very divided in this because it was over property. in a sense that so many Catholics were trying to retrieve and get back the property that had been taken from them. So Ormond then, he allowed in a Father James Taff, and he was the brother of the Earl of Carlingford. James Taff had gone to the Internuncio in Brussels, and he got permission to come back to Ireland in order to placate and to suppress Father Peter Walsh and those who were advocating the signing of this remonstrance. But as soon as he came back to Ireland, he produced a fake document which said that he was apostolic delegate of the Pope, giving him extraordinary powers, and he switched sides and went along with Father Peter Walsh, and then went around the country promoting the remonstrance, the signing of it. In the meantime then, the Duke of Ormond was promoting it as well, and he encouraged them by allowing them to operate and open friaries and churches in certain locations throughout the country. And when Oliver came back to Ireland in 1670, he could write about the 4 churches that were in Drogheda. Now, Catholics didn't own land around in the north, from here northwards, and there were no churches as such allowed. There were little mass houses and mass rocks, etc., but there were no churches. But Ormond allowed these 4 churches to be opened, for instance, in Drogheda. But these were operated and by priests who were faithful to Ormond and who willingly signed the remonstrance. So this was, I suppose, every ill wind has a silver lining, and this, because when Oliver came back, these churches, even though the remonstrance had been, obliterated at that stage and had gone by the wayside, but these churches were still in operation. So 69 priests signed, but it did cause consternation in the church. St Oliver's predecessor, he did say that it had caused more trouble, the remonstrance and Friar James Taff coming back to the country, that it had caused more trouble in the church in Ireland than Cromwell did. So the church was really divided. So, and this is what Oliver was coming back into, just only a couple of years, 2 years later. So in 1679 then, Edmund O'Reilly, Oliver's predecessor, died in Selmore in France. And Rome knew the situation in Ireland. Things were really divided. Something had to be done. So they decided then that, Rome decided that they would appoint 4 archbishops to Ireland. At that time, there hadn't been archbishops. Father Patrick Plunkett, Oliver's tutor and first cousin of his mother, he was appointed Bishop of Ardagh, and later was appointed Bishop of Meath. And for a time, he was the only active bishop in the country. The only other bishop was a bishop in Kilmore, Emma McSweeney, and he was an invalid. And he remained actually all during the Cromwell's conquest of Ireland. This Eugene McSweeney he was in hiding, he was an invalid. He was in hiding. He wasn't active, but there was always at least one bishop in Ireland. So it was decided anyway that something needed to be done about Ireland, and particularly the north of Ireland, because there was this is where the cleavage was. This is where, the Gael met Pale, if you like, in Armagh. And Dundalk was that in particular, that particular cleavage, if you like. So in Rome, it was decided that something needed to be done. So 4 archbishops were going to be appointed to Ireland. Now, Archbishop Edmund O'Reilly was the last of the archbishops, if you like. Armagh was the last one to become vacant, because this man was still in exile in France. He hadn't been allowed to come back. So Pope, at a meeting in Rome to decide on a successor to Edmund O'Reilly, So Pope Clement IX, he would have known St Oliver. He was Secretary of State in his earlier days, not that long before. He was a nuncio, different places, and he had operated from Propaganda Fide College. And some years later, Oliver could write, when he was trying to effect his reforms, and he was writing to Cardinal Barberini and those in the Propaganda Fide College, the committee whom he reported to regularly, and he reported that, he was trying to effect reforms here in Ireland, and he said, in what state I found the Propaganda Fide College when I went there, and in what state I left it in. So, and he was talking to these people who knew him. So Pope Clement IX knew Oliver, and he knew of his work. So they were discussing at a meeting in Rome, they were discussing who to send to Ireland, and Pope Clement said, quote, "But why are we discussing the merits of others when we have here in Rome a native of that island whose merits are known to us, and whose labours in this city have already added so many wreaths to peerless glory of the island of saints? Let Dr. Oliver Plunkett become the Archbishop of Armagh." And so it was. So Oliver Plunkett came back to Ireland the 7th of March in 1670. Coincidentally, he arrived at 9 a.m. in the morning, and coincidentally, because of the Julian calendar, etc., that date was actually 10 days behind Rome, and they were actually in Rome, they were actually celebrating St. Patrick's Day in Rome, and there would have been great festivities in Rome, and that very morning in Rome they would have been praying for Oliver Plunkett, no doubt, who had just landed in Ringsend in Dublin on that morning of March the 10th. So here we have the sign that's still there, of course, in Ballybarrick. Now, when he came back to Ireland, he said that he wrote that three relatives, three knights of his, vied to give him accommodation. But he said, I've decided to stay with the Baron under the patronage and care of the Baron of Louth, Lord Louth, because it will be in the centre of my diocese, and he would be able to go forward from there. And he was also thinking of Gael and Pale. He was between the two, if you like, in a loose sense. So, and he was able, it was a good springboard for him to go to the other dioceses throughout the Northern Province. Because at that time, there hadn't been any other active bishops in his province of the then 11 dioceses, except Father Patrick Plunkett in Meath, who was quite elderly. Here we have the Ballybarrick, which is festivities there, the annual Mass, which was held there a few years ago. It's normally held on the second Sunday of July every year. We don't know exactly when he came to Ballybarrick. He came back to Ireland in March 1670. I believe it was in May 1671 that he came to Ballybarrick. We know that in the first week in June, he was writing that I am now staying in Ballybarrick in the house that I've built with Jesuits. We don't know how many Jesuits. He then goes on to speak about, we know he built a school in Drogheda the previous year. So we know that he was staying in Ballybarrick in early June in 1671. So now it's generally believed that he had a house at the front, church, chapel at the back, and he may well have had the school. He did mention a school in one of his letters. He mentioned a school in Dundalk. He had the Jesuits there, and he would have used them, obviously. He said he was using them for his secretarial duties. Now, St Oliver was noted for his letter writing. He wrote to all the bishops in Ireland. He had contacts in England, in London. He had contacts in Rome, contacts in Brussels. So he's writing to all these people. See, he would make a marvellous spy master. He had his finger on the pulse. He knew what was going on throughout Europe. When he first came to the diocese, we reckon that it wasn't with Lord Louth, but it was with Sylvester Matthews or McMahon in the Haggardstown area that he stayed. We know that he ordained a son of Andrew, a son of Sylvester Matthews in Haggardstown, and he became titular abbot of Mellifont. He was a Cistercian. The monastery was long gone, of course, at that stage. So we know that much, and we think that he stayed with the Matthews for that period until he moved here. He did write that he didn't have any help. He stayed with a relative, he mentioned, but I didn't have any, and they were his words, he didn't have any help. But when he built his house and Ballybarrack, he had help. He had he mentioned Jesuits in the plural, so he had help, secretarial help, and they wouldn't have been full-time writing his letters and helping him with correspondence. They would have been doing other things during the day. So obviously his school in Drogheda, in Dundalk was here in Ballybarrack. Everything points to that. Now, this is the start of, Nicholas Plunkett, styled Sir Nicholas after that, after his papal knighthood. He advised Oliver, gave him two pieces of advice. One was never to excommunicate any priest whom he had difficulty with, but to suspend him. Otherwise, he would become under the law of praemunire, which was a law, an all-encompassing law, which forbade anyone from having any allegiance to any foreign state, but in particular to the Pope. The second piece of advice was to keep friendly with the Protestant ruling class, to keep friendly with them. Now, after the Restoration, King Charles and the committee, etc., in London, they appointed new viceroys, they changed them, etc., but they were more benign. When Oliver came first, the first viceroy he was under was John Roberts. Now, it all depended on the instructions that the viceroys were getting from London. John Roberts was persecuting Oliver for a time, a short time, quite a short time, and Oliver was reported to the National Council, and they would have been more bigoted, if you like, and they were, most of them were Cromwellians, Puritans, etc., while after a time, as the Restoration bedded in, King Charles was able to appoint more people who are more favourable to, I suppose, to him in positions of power in Ireland. But he was able to, King Charles was putting in the upper echelons, but the middle echelons and the lower echelons, the local governors and the local magistrates, when Oliver came back to Ireland, they were still, in the main, they were still Cromwellians and Puritans, etc. They were the adventurers and the sons of adventurers. They were still in power, they still had the land, if you like. So there was always that difficulty so Sir Nicholas strongly advised Oliver to keep in with the ruling classes. Now, Oliver did just that. He went to Henry Moore, the Earl of Drogheda, in Drogheda. His wife was Alice, and she was Alice Spencer of Althorp in England, one of the Lady Diana's, Princess Diana's people, if you like, distant relations. So Henry Moore and Alice, they were quite helpful to him. They allowed Oliver a church with bells on his estates, which were outside the control of the bigoted National Council here in Ireland. So he was able to operate these. The Earl of Drogheda, Henry Moore, a very powerful man. So his son was married to the Earl of Charlemont's daughter. And the Earl of Charlemont's daughter, the Earl of Charlemont also became very, very useful possibly his St Oliver's, not benefactor, but really somebody who could depend on him and who got Oliver out of trouble and got Catholics out of trouble in Northern Ireland. For instance, the Earl of Dungannon impeded St Oliver from confirmation ceremonies in Dungannon, but the Earl of Charlemont came on the scene and strongly rebuked him. And he said to Oliver, come to my courtyard and you can have confirmation ceremonies there anytime you wish. Oliver removed the vicar, he removed several vicars, he removed the vicar of Derry Diocese, Terence Kelly. Terence Kelly had been in situ as vicar of Derry Diocese, living with his lady friend and numerous children. And a previous vicar had, this was going on for 20 odd years, a previous vicar had tried to remove him, and the previous vicar was imprisoned because he was, Terence Kelly, he said he reported him to the authorities for this, under this law of praemunire, allegiance to a foreign state, and particularly to the Vatican. So the Earl of Charlemont was quite helpful to him. Now, the Earl of Charlemont's daughter was married to the son of the Earl of Drogheda, but the Earl of Charlemont's the Earl of Charlemont's son was married to the daughter of James Margetson, who was the Archbishop of the Protestant Archbishop of Armagh. So there was a connection between those three families, if you like, Margetson and the Earl of Charlemont and Drogheda. So again, the Earl of Charlemont, when he had been up the north, James Margetson, the Archbishop, asked Oliver to call to him, which Oliver did. And Oliver wrote that he gave him precedence in his own house and said that he wouldn't interfere with him in any way. So Oliver then had a clear run. He had all these, the most powerful, the higher echelons, bedded down. Roberts then, in Dublin, Oliver was reported to the National, I'll call it the bigoted National Council, for want of a better word. I'm allowed to say these things. Oliver was reported to this council as Archbishop of Armagh, coming back to Ireland as representative of the Pope. So the Earl of Roscommon, who would have some connections with Oliver, a Protestant, would have had some connections on his mother's side. But anyway, went to the council and went guarantor on Oliver's behalf with the council. Oliver had been good to him and had met him and shown him around Rome some years earlier when the Earl of Roscommon was on his grand tour of Europe, had visited Rome. So Oliver, during his term in Rome, although a Protestant, the Earl of Roscommon was a Protestant, but Oliver had shown him around. So these people were quite helpful to him. So it's not true to say that, the Protestants were down to get Oliver. That's not true to say at all. In fact, there was only one prominent Protestant in Ireland who went out of his way to condemn Oliver. Henry Jones, the Protestant Bishop of Meath, and he was a Welshman, but he was also a Cromwellian, and he was Scoutmaster General with Oliver's army during the conquest, the Cromwellian conquest, and he was the only Irish Protestant who really went out of his way, if you like, the only prominent Protestant in Ireland who went out of the way to really condemn Oliver. Okay, here we have a thurible which is found at Ballybarrick. 16th century Celtic motifs on it. It's now in Maynooth Museum. So, politics again, the English politics again. In 1672, Oliver was in Ireland for 2 years at that time. King Charles II introduced, it was a new law, which allowed freedom of conscience, if you like, and freedom of worship to declaration of indulgence in 1672. And it allowed Catholics. It would have allowed Catholics to go to church, basically, and have a freedom to worship. The Protestants and the Puritans were not at all happy in this, and they were quite strong in the House of Commons in London. The following year then, rumours were rife that the heir to the throne, the Duke James, the Duke of York, had become a Catholic. These rumours then weren't denied, were soon confirmed, and the House of Commons was in uproar. King Charles had no legitimate children. He might have had a dozen or more illegitimate children, but he had no legitimate children. So the Duke of York, his brother, was the heir to the throne. And if he was a Catholic, he did become a Catholic. He was married to a Catholic. King Charles was married to a Catholic. King Charles' mother was a Catholic. So there's lots of influence there. And on his deathbed, King Charles became a Catholic the evening before he died. So there was lots of Catholic influence there. So King Charles did wish to have, fair play, if you like, and in his kingdom, but the Puritans, who were gaining control, this tussle, power struggle between the Parliament, between the House of Commons and the throne was ongoing. King Charles then, he'd be looking for money, and the Parliament would start wars, and then King Charles would be looking for money, and he'd need the Parliament, and then be looking. They in turn would be looking for X, Y, and Z before they'd allow taxes, etc. So this ongoing struggle was there all of the time, and in 1673, the Test Act was introduced, which brought back into force the penal laws. Bishops, etc., and senior ecclesiastics were banned. Oliver had to go into hiding, strict hiding. At that time, up to then, he had things under control, and his rule was, and he told all his priests and his fellow bishops in the country, never to get involved in politics under any circumstances, and to keep a low profile, to carry on doing what, and as Oliver said, that's all I ever wanted, was to be able to go from place to place, to offer Mass, to confirm the children and the adults, because over the previous generation, the 1640s, we had the Ulster Uprising, Confederation, the Confederate Wars, 1640s, 1650s, the Cromwellian Conquest, the 1660s, there was no church leadership in Ireland whatsoever. And then hence we had all of these divisions in the church in Ireland. So that was in the 1660s. So for that previous 30 years, there hadn't been bishops, people weren't confirmed. And Oliver was telling people, he wrote in his letters, there are men, bearded men of 60, coming to me for confirmation. So he's noted for his confirmations, and he travelled right across. He had 4 horses that he kept well exercised. And he appointed a new vicar to the Diocese of Raphoe, Donegal, and he wrote that I brought him to Donegal to show him the passes, how to get there, and to introduce him around the diocese. And he travelled across as there was at that stage, in the early days, there was no other bishop in the Northern Province, no other active bishops, and he was very active right across. And hence now, if you talk to people in Donegal, in Derry, in Antrim, and they'll tell you, local parishioners will tell you, oh yes, St Oliver was at that Mass Rock. Oliver had to go into hiding. It's recorded that he wrote about it, that he went into South Armagh, and he was almost suffocated. He was informed on one Sunday evening, the feast of the chair of St Peter, he was informed that the authorities were coming out from Dundalk to catch him, and he had to go into hiding. Now, he may well have been in Ballybarrack at the time, and he had to go into hiding. So he went down to South Armagh, and the weather was atrocious, and he said that himself and his companion, later Archbishop John Brennan, was with him, and they were almost suffocated in snowdrifts. And he mentions just arriving at the house of a poor farmer who had nothing to lose, so to speak, and he put him in an attic where he remained for 10 days because there was somebody staying in the house that he didn't want them to know that Oliver and his companion was staying in the attic. So he was in hiding there for 10 days. And Oliver suffered great privations after that. He'd said, you know, if for a piece of, they were living on gruel, if you like, and for a piece of bread, he said, or a drink of buttermilk, he often spoke about it, that they suffered great privations at that time. So this is our Patrick. When he came back, things settled down after a few months. And in 73, 74, as an aside to that, there was a terrible famine in this area in 73, 74. The following year in 74, he reckoned that 500 people had died in the diocese of Armagh. So they suffered terrible privations at the time. So he came back and he set up he built here, this was an old ruin which was in Ardpatrick, just outside Louth village. And I should add that, so he moved there, and for the remainder of his time as Archbishop, he lived in Ardpatrick. He ordained quite a few priests here. 9 in Ballybarrick, something like 47 in Ardpatrick. Because his college for priests in Drogheda was a very important element. And he had come back to reform the church in Ireland. He had come back to reform the priesthood in Ireland. And he did just that. He actually succeeded in that. The school in Drogheda, he had 150 pupils in it. He built it from the foundations up. He supplied, as he said himself, I supplied even the frying pan. And he had it built within 3 months. So there was no onboard planala and no objections, and he just went ahead. You own a little plot of land and you build, and so be it. He had the Jesuits there. He had 3 Jesuits and a brother, 150 students, and he did tremendous work there. But he also was bringing priests there, usually 25 at a time. And then he had Father Edmund Drumgool, Clogher headman. He was a fine priest. He appointed him a vicar of Clogher diocese for a while after that. And he taught the priests in theology and controversies and that in the college in Drogheda. And Oliver wrote that he was bringing priests. In one letter he said he had 56 priests in his class in Drogheda. So this is a very important element. Now, one of the priests who were ordained in Ballybarrick in 1673, just before he moved, early in the year, was Father Patrick O'Donnelly. And later, Bishop Patrick O'Donnelly, otherwise known as the Bard of Armagh, because he went round the country disguised, if you like, or as the singing priest, and as a singing minstrel, so to speak. But he was actually Bishop Patrick O'Donnelly of Dromore diocese. And he carried the can, and he was the only bishop in the north of the country during the stricter penal laws in the early 1700s. His brother became a bishop after him, became a bishop of Derry sometime later. So Ardpatrick became a very important place as well, and most of his I suppose, ordinations were held there. Most of them because his priests were now coming on stream. He didn't ordain anybody unless they were properly, prepared and formed. So he was bringing them to Drogheda in groups of 25 and up to 56 at a time, including this man, Bishop Patrick O'Donnelly. So he was. It was an important element, if you like, of his apostolate, this forming the priests and training them, etc. Now, one of the great difficulties he had with his priests, and he said, was the demon drink. And he said, if only we could eradicate this problem for the drink from the priests, they would be saints. So he forbade priests from drinking whiskey and from frequenting taverns. Obviously, you're traveling from A to B. If of necessity, you'd have to go into a tavern for a meal or a drink or whatever, but from frequenting taverns and from drinking spirits and possibly poteen as well, I don't know. Okay. Now we'll come to, so here's the tree at Ard Patrick, and this has been written about for generations past, as into the last century, that St Oliver hid in this tree. It's well over 300, possibly 500 years old, in Ard Patrick. Okay, now we're coming to Dundalk. Okay, so here we have, yeah, of course, Blackrock Church. So the oldest church in the world, dedicated to St Oliver, or Blessed Oliver as it was, in 1924. So this church they got special permission because he was just Blessed Oliver in 1924, and the church was built there, a very fine cut stone church. So we have a bust of St Oliver here outside. And then we have the foundation stone and a relic inset here in the stone, a relic of St Oliver, and one of the old stones here from Ballybarrack. Okay, an old map of Dundalk, and St Oliver, what did he say about Dundalk? He said it had a population of 2,000. He said there was a Franciscan friary there, a convent as he called them, a Franciscan convent with 3 priests, and that the population of 2,000 was comprised of a quarter of them were Catholics. And that was the way, that was typical, the same in Drogheda. Most of the rest of the county, it could be 20-1 Catholics to Protestants. The rest of the county would be, a vast majority of people would be Catholic. But certainly in the towns and cities, it was all Protestant, yeah. The vast majority. Okay. Now, St Oliver performed many other ordinations in different locations. Here we have Castletown and Haggardstown. And I did mention Father Andrew Matthews, who was ordained here, the titular abbot of Cullen. And then we have Mullyharlan Massrock, which is close by. And this is an important one. It's one of the Massrocks in which we believe that St Oliver visited and offered Mass at, and possibly confirmed people at. There's a little dip on the top of the stone there, and it's the water that would lodge there. People would say that there would be it was miraculous, if you like, so to speak. There were cures from it. And that monument was erected, the cross was erected in 1922, Father Donlan, I think. Okay, this just symbolizes his confirmations. And as I say, at one stage he wrote that I have confirmed 45,430, whatever it was, and I have a record of them all. A record of them all. Okay, so some of the locations associated with St Oliver, and as I say, some are definitely recorded, other are by tradition, and we cannot discount this tradition because we do know that St Oliver, he was everywhere. He was everywhere. So yeah, certainly some of them are by tradition, but most of them are certainly recorded. And you can see in the count, you know, from Dublin, Kildare, Westmeath, all of those counties. And you could go. I mean, I've spoken to people in Leitrim and Roscommon, and they tell me that there's Massrock here and there, so in both counties. And I know people who have spoken about the local Massrock that St Oliver is reputed to have visited. Okay, here we have Castletown, the home of Sir John Bellew, and he was a benefactor of St Oliver. Now his mother was connected, one of the Bellews of Lord Louth, the Baron of Louth. So there was that connection with the family, and he was quite helpful to Oliver. One of the St Oliver wrote that he had visited and he was there at lunch and dinner and all of that. So we know that has happened. One of the difficulties that St Oliver got into was with discipline in the clergy. He had come to implement the Council of Trent of St Oliver's 11 predecessors, only one of them had spent more than 2 years in the Archdiocese. And that was Hugh O'Reilly. So you have to go back to 1490 to Archbishop Octavio Pelagio, an Italian, who was appointed to Armagh in 1490. And before you come across an archbishop who spent any length of time and did any amount of work in the Archdiocese of Armagh. So that was 1490. That was 201 years before St Oliver's death. So you're talking about 2 centuries of that time. So the Archdiocese of Armagh was greatly disorganized. The Archdiocese of Armagh needed, above all else, somebody who would be a strong reformer. And Oliver was just that. They picked Pope Clement the Ninth, picked the right man, for the right time. Okay, now we go on to the Franciscans, the controversy of the Franciscans. One of the great difficulties that Oliver had was the Franciscans and the Dominicans had a great tussle over the ownership of 3 Dominican friaries. Well, they were Dominican friaries, but over 3 abandoned abbeys in Ireland. One was in Gala in CLAHS, the other was Carlingford in the Diocese of Armagh, and the third was Newtownards in the then Diocese of Down. After the Restoration, the Franciscans were the first to trickle back into the country in any numbers. And any property that the Cromwellians or the Anglicans didn't want, they took the roofs off it, or they set fire to it, or they used it as stables. So if we don't need it, the Catholics aren't going to have it. So there was no property, nothing available to the Franciscans as they trickled back into the country. Both are aware of these disused, abandoned, ruined abbeys in these 3 locations, as I say, and they say, well, okay, that's fine. There hasn't been anyone here for a long time. 4 walls, we'll do something with this. So they held on to these. Dominicans then came back in, oh, that's ours. What are you doing here? But more than that, it meant if Franciscans or Dominicans owned property or owned a friary, what they called convents at the time, that allowed them to seek alms or to what they called quest. So if you didn't have a presence, if you didn't own a convent, well then you didn't have that consequent right to seek alms. And this was one of the problems that Oliver had, because every year the Dominicans and Franciscans would be coming around the parish churches questing before the parish mass, and they would seek payment or payment in kind from the parishioners, and it was a cause of tension and problems with them. So Oliver asked Rome to decide on the matter. The 2 orders between themselves agreed that they would settle the matter. They didn't. They then agreed that it would go to Rome for arbitration, and nothing was happening. The problems were building up in Ireland, tensions were building, so Oliver said, listen, I will arbitrate if you ask me to, but I know it's going to cause me a lot of trouble. Oliver went to these 3 locations. He was asked to arbitrate. He went to these 3 locations, and yes, they were 3 ruined Dominican abbeys. The Dominicans had title to them. He ruled in favour of the Dominicans, and as Oliver said himself, all hell broke loose with calumnies and all sorts of stories written about St Oliver. He was against the Franciscans, etc., etc. So as I say, there were 2 problems. One was the ownership of these abbeys, but more important to the Franciscans was that the Dominicans now were going around seeking alms at the parish churches and around the diocese. So that was a great problem for them. Now, Oliver then sought reform in the Franciscans. And they were quite disorganized. They were a much bigger order, of course, in the country. They were disorganized. He said that they had 12 or 13 novitiates in the northern province. Like Dundalk would be taking novices, Drogheda would be taking novices, Armagh would be taking novices, and so in the province, in the different dioceses, there would be 12 or 13, and he said, with 1 or 2 novices perhaps in each, and no particular convent could give proper formation to these young men. He said, why not have one novitiate in the northern half of the country, another novitiate in the southern half of the country? It's hard enough to get 1 or 2 people of sufficient knowledge and talent to be able to form these young men and teach them. But how can you do it in 12 or 13 and up to 30 novitiates throughout the whole country? So Oliver wrote to the chapter of the Franciscans in Elphin, they were having it at the time. First of all, he suggested that instead of having one national provincial, if you like, that it would have a northern section and a southern section. So it would be more Gael orientated in the north and more Pale in the south, if you like, so to speak. So he suggested that they only have a novitiate in the northern part of the country and one in the southern part of the country. He suggested that they not drink whiskey as he instructed his own parish clergy not to do. He advised them that they should walk as the Franciscans do in the continent, rather than bringing horses and even servants with them. He suggested that the Franciscans should not wear expensive clothes and cravats, but that they should wear the cheaper sort of clothing. And St Oliver, in another letter, he wrote that he himself wore the cheaper sort of clothing, which was called frieze. It was an Irish cloth. So he was very strong in reform of the parish clergy, or the diocesan clergy. He did focus in on the Franciscans, but they needed reform. So the Franciscans were in need of, there was tremendous need of reform at that time. So Oliver had become public enemy number 1 in the eyes of many, many Franciscans. James Porter, he was the guardian in in Dundalk, and he met Oliver one day, and he said to him that we will treat you as we did a previous Archbishop of Armagh, who had died shortly after the Great Plague, Richard Fitzralph, and he's buried in St Nicholas's cemetery here in Dundalk. The Franciscans had hounded him at that time as well. So there was great need for reform, and Oliver really did focus in on the Franciscans. He did, and he created a lot of enemies. But in fairness, anything he did, he felt he was justified, and there was genuine need of reform. I felt it important just to relay this difficulty that Oliver had. The importance he came to reform the church. He was sent to reform the church in Ireland. And he did, you see, he achieved that. Okay, so here we have, now, in 1678, we have the exclusion crisis, where the Parliament in the House of Commons in London decided that the Duke of York, as a Catholic, could never, or any other Catholic, as it still stands today, could never become king or ruling monarch. So Oliver was arrested after that, because there was a bounty put on his head, not to kill him as such, but there was a price put on his head, and all the ecclesiastics in Ireland. He said he wouldn't go into exile again. He said he would stay with his people, and he was quite prepared to go back into hiding. And here we have, after his arrest, he was brought to Dublin Castle. They didn't find anything incriminating in his papers, and he was brought then to face trial here in Dundalk. So there's a lot of debate as to where exactly the court was and the jail was, the assizes was. Cardinal Fee thought that it was in this area here. Other people feel that it's in this area here. So there's a lot of debate. The jury is out on that one. But within 30 yards, 40 yards of that area. So York Street and Church Street, isn't it, as it is now? Yeah, Church Street, yeah. Okay, so then they decided that he was brought to trial here in Dundalk. We're not sure exactly where it was. Now, the parish of Killeavy was rampant with Tories at the time. Although Oliver, with Berkeley's help, had reduced the Tories and their strength, if you like. Most of them had gone into exile in 1670. The Rapparees, the Tories stroke Rapparees, yeah. So the Tories were quite strong, and it came to the fore again in the mid-1670s, 1676, etc. Patrick Fleming, etc. You know about Patrick Fleming. He was put to death. He was assassinated in Inniskeen. He, on his pocket, why we mention him is because he had been given, he sought a pardon from the Viceroy. And Oliver negotiated a pardon with him, for him. And he was ambushed at an inn just outside Inniskeen. And he was murdered by the Redcoats and his companions there at Inniskeen. But on his person was a letter from Oliver Plunkett, addressed to Father Manus O'Quinn, who was the parish priest of the area at the time, of Fleming's area. And it was addressed, it was for Patrick Fleming, the Tory. And on it was about the agreement, and that for he to take the carriage, Sir John's carriage, go to Dublin and be exiled for a few years. Oliver said that that exile would be a short one, and in the interim, Oliver had arranged that for Patrick Fleming's wife to receive an annual subvention of £10 per year. And as Oliver said in the letter, in Oliver's own handwriting, that it would be a short exile. He expected it to be a short exile. So on this letter was retrieved and was brought forward to Oliver's trial 4 years later, was it? And at the trial, the implication being that Oliver was inducing the Tories and Patrick Fleming and others to go abroad and to organise an invasion of Ireland and bring the French into Ireland. And this is the charge that was made against Oliver, bring an army of 70,000 Frenchmen into Ireland. So, okay. He was brought to Dundalk. The trial fell through at Dundalk. The trial didn't go ahead at Dundalk because although there were 2 depositions made, John McMoyer was one, and he made a deposition about St Oliver and the treachery of planning to bring these people in. And there was a Father James O'Callaghan, and he made a deposition against Oliver for praemunire, so not for treason, but just that Oliver was operating under the Pope, if you like, and he was acting under Pope's orders. James O'Callaghan wasn't accusing him of treason, but John McMoyer was. John McMoyer had been a priest, he was a Franciscan, and he had been a curate to Father Edmund Murphy, also of that Killeavy. Killeavy parish was a huge parish, of the Fews right down to Kilcurry, right down into County Louth, much bigger than the 3 Killeavy parishes, Upper, Middle and Lower Killeavy now. So there were 4 priests involved in that large parish, really controlled by the Tories at that time, or the Rapparees, and these were all corrupted by the Tories. They were involved in accepting stolen goods. Father Edmund Murphy was accused of storing stolen goods and other offences. It was a capital offence. So Edmund Murphy, who had given a deposition in Dublin against Oliver, didn't turn up at the trial at Dundalk because he was afraid of being arrested and probably being hanged because it was a capital offence. John McMoyer, likewise, didn't turn up at Dundalk. He said he made the excuse because Edmund Murphy wouldn't turn up. So the trial, although there were depositions on file, the trial actually fell through on the second day. So as Oliver, during the time Oliver was being brought to Dundalk, London had decided that he would be tried in Dublin. But when the trial fell through in Dundalk, they decided he would bring him to London. And very briefly, Oliver wasn't going to stand any chance in London. Now, it was a rule of the law at the time that at any trial, that you would be tried by your peers, and the jury would be of your peers, local peers who would know you. So by being sent over to England, he had no chance of that. The jury, the jury were charged with investigating and becoming familiar with the facts of the case. That was the law as it was. The jury were expected to do that, to spend some time and to become acquainted with the facts of the case. Completely different today, of course, but in those days. So when he went to London, the jury was a packed jury, of course, and he stood no chance whatsoever. So he was hung, drawn, and quartered on the 1st of July, old style, in 1680. This would be a true representation of Tyburn at the time, Marble Arch, a stand, great big crowd, the gallows, the triple tree. Next time you're in Marble Arch, just have a look. There are 3 oak trees standing there now, which have been planted where Marble Arch is, where the gallows was, and that could hang 15, 20 people. There was a huge gallows. So he was dragged on a sled backwards like that with Edward Fitzharris to Tyburn, and he was hung, drawn, and quartered there, as I say. 1681. That's the stone which is on the ground now at Marble Arch, Tyburn. This is the reliquary which held St Oliver's head. It's now in the Siena convent in Drogheda. And this is the actual reliquary which was sent to Lambspring and sent to Rome, because the head actually went to Rome and came back to Ireland about 30 years after, 40 years after St Oliver's martyrdom. The head of St Oliver here in Drogheda, okay. St Patrick's here in Dundalk, beautiful stained glass, and then St Malachy's. I like that one. Sorry, yeah. His canonisation then, 1975. Bishop Donald McKeown, this is this young man here. He sent me this picture. The reason I show it here tonight is because here we have St John Paul. So, okay, in 1975. So that's the reason I said it. So, and then in 3 years later, he was elected Pope, and then he came to Killinear the following year. Yeah. So when he venerated the head of St Oliver, the stamp which was brought out at that time, and the canonisation picture. So I just want to finish off, if I may. Monsignor John Handley, he was the postulator of the cause, and he stated that it is possible that Archbishop Oliver might not have died if he had been less conscientious as a reforming bishop. I think we can agree with that. John Gibney, in his book Ireland and the Popish Plot, states that Oliver's Plunkett death certainly brought an end to all the Irish aspects of the plot, which it did. And I recommend this. Paul Smith, in his excellent book, only published a few weeks ago, Catholics and the Law in Restoration Ireland, says that in some respects, Oliver's character has been obscured by hagiography. But yet, his determined and powerful personality shines vividly through in his letters. Canis Mooney, in his article, OFM, about 60 years ago, in his accusations, in an article written about the accusations made against Oliver, said that the tragedy of Oliver's life might be traced to the fact that his training, outlook and temperament were at odds with the people in his Ulster diocese. But now, in my own view, all true, but I think it would also be true to say that there can be no excuse for the often lethargic, laissez-faire, and sometimes even disgraceful conduct of some of the other principal actors in the tragic drama. There have been many books and articles written about St Oliver. I think 74 books have been written about him, and each one has something to offer. And there's a good reason why there are 74 books written about St Oliver. He was a remarkable man. He bravely set about badly needed reform in the Church of Ireland. And just because he was hung, drawn and quartered at Tyburn, many would see his life as a failure. But it was anything but. He did achieve the reform of the clergy in his province, not just the Archdiocese of Armagh, but in the province. There have been more than a few bad apples, and as we know, bad apples tend to corrupt other apples. These were often corrupted by the Tories and their ill-gotten gains, along with some other priests who had trouble with drink and or womanizing. He did train and ordain and train hundreds of priests, and these good men undoubtedly helped to save the Catholic faith in Ireland during the harsh penal laws which were already coming down the tracks, notably Bishop Patrick O'Donnelly and others. Perhaps even unbeknownst to them, he did help to reform the Franciscans. For many of those friars who were at best grossly disrespectful to the primate, or at worst guilty of calumny, not to mind perjury, and who had actively plotted and agitated against him and his policies during the 1670s, were very much chastened and humbled men afterwards. There was a remarkable change there. Oliver had sensed correctly that the length of time given to him to achieve his goals might be short, writing at the time that when the sailor has a fair wind, he sets full sail. Oliver did just that. He set full sail whenever possible. A professor for 12 years in Propaganda Fide College, Oliver trained priests for the missions with a special emphasis on being able to counter the arguments of the Protestant Reformation. Upon his return to Ireland, he stated that the Council of Trent had not yet been fully implemented in Ireland, and it was clearly his goal that it would be so. Now, question. If all the principals in the tragedy were to live their lives over, would they do any differently? I honestly believe that Oliver would change very little. He didn't seek out martyrdom, but he was caught up at the political shenanigans of the English House of Commons in their tussle with the king. I do believe that the Franciscans order would certainly handle things very differently, nationally and congregationally, by keeping personnel on a tighter leash and not allowing matters to get out of hand as happened. And as regards to the Vatican, despite the inherent difficulty of reconciling two separate dicasteries of the Vatican, one for the secular clergy and one for the religious, I believe that Rome would also be much more proactive in their actions if given another chance in the circumstances. It must be emphasized that Archbishop Oliver, who was renowned for his love and loyalty to the See of Peter, had kept Rome informed at all stages of his work, writing, "The Holy See is the chief physician. I am the under-physician, and to me is entrusted a great number of patients. The will to cure this illness is not enough for us under-physicians. The proto-physician or senior physician must put his hands on it." Achieving as necessary and urgent reforms in a short space of time was always going to be a difficult task, requiring, as it did, some to move away from their comfort zones. Yet, Yes, he was truly a pilgrim of hope and peace in his day to the good people of his province. And of course, it must be remembered that while his cruel death at Tyburn made him a martyr, it was a life lived in virtue that made him a saint. His death did draw a line in the sand, destined as he was to become the last of the 105 Catholic martyrs of Tyburn, and the last Catholic martyr condemned by the state in these islands. Just think about that. Isn't that remarkable? Thank you.